witnessing this fascinating conference that Doriaster and mathematics organized so kindly. I saw the title of my paper is given as Myth of Truth. I'm not going to talk about myth of truth, alas, I cannot just misprint. Because I do believe that there are certain truths that I have to accept. For example, that I'm standing here in front of you, and that I'm not an authority on myth. But I will try to make some remarks quiet as a matter of fact, and I will hope that the panelists will correct me when I go astray. The position I will defend today, I will partially agree with some of the remarks that Wittgenstein made about myth in a paper he published in 1931. Also, I suppose my basic position is influenced by a paper on meaning of metaphor written by Donald Davidson, and it is to take all sentences, even of myths, as that of the profane poets, profane poetry according to Umberto Eco's comments. That is to say, they literally mean, they carry with them only their literal meaning, and whether they become myths or not, it's what you do with them. So, let me begin my reflections. Now, in the past 2 days, we've been told by various anthropologists, artists, that myth is not just a false belief. And Wittgenstein also said that myth is not to be understood as an explanatory hypothesis which happens to be false. Myth is to be understood as playing a quite different role. Now, as I said, nevertheless, the particular statements that belong to a myth have the same semantics as empirical statements. They often designate actual things, such as nature, refer to kinds of things that exist. Moreover, these statements, I want to insist, slip in and out of myth. We have to walk on a tightrope in our relationship to them. That is to say, while we treat the statements as belonging to a myth, we have to know how to suspend our judgment about its truth or falsity, except in the sense in which we would ascribe truth or falsity to fiction. Yet the moment the statements slip out of the world of myth, to which it belongs, into the realm of popular belief, we must be very concerned with the truth or falsity. And this is especially the case with myth told to support a sense of national identity or sexual differences. And so what I'm going to suggest is that to live with myths is a dangerous business which requires considerable skill and sophistication. So I'm going to make 5 points, and the first point is about the difference of explanation in illustration. Wittgenstein found account of magical and religious notions of men given by the anthropologist Fraser in his Golden Bow unsatisfactory. As Wittgenstein put it, Fraser made these notions appear as mistakes. For Fraser, a myth was like a historical or cosmological explanation, or a hypothesis, and Wittgenstein thought that it wasn't, although in the same work, he claimed that a whole mythology is deposited in our language. Notice that he didn't say the language of the tribesmen, but in our language. The view Wittgenstein was opposing thinks of myths as describing how the world developed, or how the world is believed to be. This view is common to those philosophers, anthropologists, and theologians who think that myth and science, or myth and philosophy are rivals, and think of myths as pre-science or pre-philosophy. This, I think, though, is often shared by some contemporary philosophers who I might call conventionalists in philosophy of science. I'm a distinguished member of that. And these philosophers think that science and myths are one of a kind, because science is, after all, nothing more than stories we construct to explain the data of our experience. We posit beings, such as quarks or black holes, to explain not only what is happening, but what would between myths and science as conceived by conventionalists. In the eyes of the conventionalists, there might still be special characteristic of science, for example, that it is committed to progress or amendment. But ultimately, science is one myth amongst others for them. If this were the case, Wittgenstein's provocative remark quoted above, that a whole mythology is deposited in our language, would mean nothing more than the claim made by many philosophers that all language is theory-laden. Moreover, the assertion of Jaspers, Kolakowski, and others that myth cannot be reduced to anything else would become trivial. If all language is theory-laden, and if all theory is a kind of myth, then we obviously cannot just say myths. Now, Wittgenstein's own position was, however, quite different. And although I don't agree with all the implications of what he says, I believe that Wittgenstein points to an important truth. A myth should, he is suggesting, primarily be thought of not as an explanation of this physical world, but as an expression of how reality seems to people, or illustration of how things are for them in terms of their fears, wishes, and so on. Of course, how one feels and what one wishes is connected with one's beliefs about reality, but myth is not an explanation. In the description of the content, the myth is not an explanatory description of the content of one's beliefs about reality. Now, Wittgenstein writes that if Wittgenstein, who doesn't believe that there are human superhumans somewhere who might be called gods, and yet he says meaningfully, I fear the wrath of the gods, it shows that with these words he can mean something or express a feeling that need not be connected with the belief that they are gods. Now similarly, the tribesmen described by Fraser may have been seriously expressing something in telling their myth without literally believing what they said. The tribesmen, just as Wittgenstein, understood the point of the tale. The tale is, in Wittgenstein's words, a graphic illustration, or philosophers have translated perspicuous presentation, using Darstellung, of how reality is presented to them. Anthropologists like Fraser insult these tribesmen by assuming that they are like the fundamentalists in our own society. The fact that Fraser used the words ghosts and shade to describe the way the tribesmen look at things indicate that there is something akin to their way of thinking within our language. After all, we are moved by Hamlet. We understood what thought and encountering ghosts mean. Wittgenstein suggests that the way we use words like soul or spirit is just as murky. They are not reducible, for most people at least, to naturalistic observational statements. And it seems that we understand what we say. We have our myth, which make us understand what we mean when we say that the soul pines after something, or that our spirit soars. The second point I'm going to make is about the splitting of the mind. For is Wittgenstein right about the difference of function between it and explanatory theories? And they be always split apart. In order to understand this, I would like to examine what I would believe to be one of the central myths of our time, the myth surrounding our concept of reason and sensibility. It might fit in with all the conditions that our distinguished anthropologists gave yesterday, but I'll just march on. The stories we tell to defend the position between reason and sensibility, or the purported independent existence of them, have much in common with many traditional myths. Since they depend on binary opposition that Mr. Dillon spoke about yesterday, they accord with the claim of Leibniz that mythical thought progresses from the awareness of opposition towards the resolution. They have permeated many areas of popular thinking in recent years. Some of our social theorists have been used as ingredients of stories purporting to explain the difference of males and females, of Europeans and other people. And sometimes the position is made in terms of thinking and intuition, sometimes in terms of rationality and emotion, sometimes in terms of the verbal, the instinctive, and so on. Now, people, of course, assume that they know what each of these purportedly opposing terms mean. But a little reflection, well, I think a little reflection, at least on my part, will reflect that this is far from the case. example, on the basis of which of these pairs can we judge that something is sentimental, or something is shocking, or something is exciting? Now, splitting the mind into different parts is a long-standing figurative device. We're all familiar with Plato's tripartite division of the soul, that is, the intellect, the will, and the sensual appetites. And although Aristotle immediately tried to show the pointlessness of such a picture, since once one begins partitioning the soul, there's no need to stop at 3, he said, one can have as many parts as one has different functions. People have continuously been captured by the phrase of the partitioning of the soul of the mind. Even, for example, in 1903, Weiner claimed that thinking and feeling are not separate in women. This makes her unable to really have self-conscious or reflexive thinking, which should imply that in a strict sense she has no soul. And although of course he thought that it was just talking about pure type, I think it does reveal what he thinks about the connection of the separation or non-separation of feeling and reason and the status of the soul. Now, seeing things in dichotomies, that is to say, in two opposing groups, is an equally old habit which has been revived with gusto in recent years. Combining these two traits, we have the view of the mind as composed of reason and instinct, as I said. Now, actually, Aristotle not only objected to tripartite, the soul, but had objected to the division of soul into the rational and irrational parts. And almost every interesting philosopher who has discussed imagination has said that imagination can't be detached either from reason or from sensibility. But this partitioning of the soul has remained very close to the popular and religious vocabulary. And of course, respectable philosophers have often been cited in support. Pascal is one. We have all heard of Pascal's line from the Pensée, the heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing. But Pascal's talk of the esprit de géométrie and the esprit de finesse, and his claim that we come to know truth not only through reason, but also through the heart, should be reread carefully. If we read these passages, we find that Pascal's examples of what we know by the heart, an instinct, that is to say, the connaissance du cœur, du l'instant, are not what people might expect. The examples he gives are a knowledge of space, of time, of movement, and of numbers, which he says are as certain as that of anything that we can come to know through reasoning. Pascal goes on to illustrate his point, and I'll just quote a line from him so that you might not think that I'm just inventing this new Pascal. He says, the heart feels that space has 3 dimensions and that the numbers are infinite, whereupon reason then proves that there are no square numbers such that one is double the other. So just when Pascal claims in this passage that knowledge based on reasoning has to be based on knowledge of the heart, he's not saying that mathematical knowledge has to be preceded by mystical religious intuition, or that rational understanding must be backed by emotional responses. He's saying that every reasoning, even mathematics, is based on something one accepts without proof. One accepts without proof, and so we might as well do that in matters of faith as well. If we read how Pascal describes his famous esprit de finesse, which I think should be probably translated as subtle mind rather than intuitive one, we see that it is far removed from unconscious instinct as anything could be. Pascal writes that the esprit de finesse takes note of all the principles that are in ordinary usage, there for all to see. Since the principles are so subtle and so numerous, we have to have a good sight, because it is almost impossible not to miss some of them. So Pascal concludes that all mathematicians would be subtle, be of subtle mind, if they have good sight, and that all subtle minds would be mathematicians if they could focus their sight on the familiar principles of geometry. So what seems to be an issue here are 2 qualities of thinking, rather than opposition of thinking and something else. And both, according to Pascal, involve instinct in his sense, namely accepting certain things that we accept without proof. So it is indeed ironical that in the popular thinking, the tendency to contrast reason and sensibility has increased. And for in recent years, philosophers of quite different complexion have been arguing about the importance of the inseparability of our emotions from our thinking, or our desires in minor opposition. I suggest that to see reality in terms of internal contradiction was made very fashionable by people who think the language of dialectics, because if the coexistence of two opposing tendencies or states is a necessary condition of resolution, Aufklärung, and improvement, then any dialectician, whether Hegelian or Marxist, who interests himself in change and improvement, would be tempted to see contradiction in the state outside his mind and in the state within him. And as we know from the talk yesterday, the Strauss and structurists have come with a minor opposition to make it seemingly scientific and very respectable. So, but I think that we have to be very wary about really whether things are really in minor opposition or not, and we're told that they are. So the third thing that I want to comment on is about the embodiment of different functions of the mind in different groups of people. The traditional stories told to show that some conflicting and separate functions of the mind were about divided or partitioned soul within each person. The contemporary stories do the opposite, although I suppose that it has its origins in Greek times too. People see in different groups or sectors of the population the embodiment, as it were, of the opposing functions of the mind. They say, for example, that women are emotive or intuitive, and that men are rational and discursive, or that Africans are intuitive and Europeans rational, or that Asians respond to nature through their sensibility and Europeans through discursive understanding, and so on. Often the stories seem to begin in order to express a norm or even a wish that women should be emotive and men discursive. The women of the Bushmen of the Kalahari should be rich in instinct, is distinct from men of Europeans, for sake of their conceptual understanding of reality. It's maintained by both who hold the other sexual race in contempt, or those who romanticize them. Equally by groups who feel that they do not have their role to play in the mainstream of events and feel ignored, and who tell stories to build up their sense of identity or even of uniqueness. That one belongs to a chosen race or chosen sex is a comforting belief to have, even if we cannot support it with covenants or with God or oh God to strengthen the point we make. Now, instead of our interactions with God, we have tended to import bits of science or pseudoscience to lend authority, lend authenticity to our claims. For example, people have talked about dominance of different hemispheres of the brain that is assumed to exist in different groups of people, to explain why one group of people are more intuitive or more discursive. Just as foremost were once invoked, not only to explain the difference in physical abilities, the two sexes, but the manner of their thinking. Theories to enforce localized functions of the brain, effects of blood types, or evolutionary stories of social violence of all kinds, and incorporated into stories of quite different groups of people and body separate functions of the mind. And so, this leads me to the fourth point that I want to point out, connected with this, that this is a compatibility of scientific and mythical thinking. We saw earlier that Wittgenstein chided Fraser for being so naive as to fail to see the point of the myths and accompanying rituals and magical acts of the craftsman. He points out that burning in effigy of the enemy by the so-called primitive men, described by Fraser, is exactly like artisting the picture of a loved one. We wouldn't immediately say of ourselves that we confuse the representation and the representative. As Wittgenstein comments, and I quote from him, this is obviously not based on a belief that it will have a definite effect on the object which the picture represents. It aims at some satisfaction and it achieves it. Or rather, it does not aim at anything. We act in this way, then feel satisfied. Now, according to Wittgenstein, then, the craftsmen are obviously aware of the difference, the representation and the thing represented, or what they become as myth and the factual descriptions of things around them, because, as he says, the same savage who apparently, in order to kill his enemy, sticks his knife through a picture of him, really does build his hut of wood and cuts his arrow with skill, and not an effigy. The people, they say, that the savage sticking his knife through the picture must believe in the causal efficacy of his action. And we were told by distinguished anthropologists in this conference that they do. Yes, but why should it be so? Only because he believes that he is expressing his hatred of the person who's following the kids in the correct way, and with his right magic. And hopefully a supernatural being will take notice and carry out his wishes. But similarly, a Christian lighting a candle or saying the litany for the cure of a sick friend does not believe that the candle or the sound of the litany literally causes the illness to go away in the way penicillin does. He believes that he's expressing his wish, say to the Virgin Mary, in the right way so that she may intercede and may God produce the cure. So in our language, the stories we imagine to illustrate how an aspect of reality appears to us against the background of which we express our wishes and feelings, and the description we make of the world around us are intermingled, and yet we can keep them apart. We also know that they are acts that we carry out to express ourselves rather than to achieve some goal. So, in that sense, at least we can agree with Wittgenstein that those things coexist in us too. With the example of Wittgenstein like this, Schubert's brother, cutting certain of Schubert's scores into small bits when Schubert died, in giving his favorite pupils these pieces of a few bars each. So it was not useful in any way, so we might wonder, but we do in doing such acts. Now, it may be claimed that such a distinction between myth and science is possible only if we hold a crude, naive realist view or positivist view about science, which Wittgenstein might have done. But this is not the case. I won't go into detail now, but the view about science of Wittgenstein, since his very early writings, is almost as conventionalist as that of quantum Leibniz or Professor Martin. And so it wasn't that Wittgenstein thought that the difference between mythology and physics existed in the existence of human constructs or arbitrary elements in the former and not in the latter. It lay rather in the different points the people who subscribed to the myths were making. But it might be said that if the myths and science are playing such different roles, why should science have come to replace myth? Mythical cosmologies have been overtaken by the cosmology of astrophysics. People might, or some of our speakers have noticed. Does this not indicate that they play the same function? This is where I want to come to the fifth point, which is related to answering this question. And this is the transfer of claims from myth to theory. This is my final point. But the problem is not so simple, because the relationship of belief and action, even that of telling fiction, recounting stories, is always a complex one. First, myth may be told as a graphic illustration of how people feel or wish the world to be, and yet the myth may gradually create the belief in the people who fill it, that the world is explained by it. We all know the temptation to end up believing the tales we once invented. Especially if the tales are not of our own personal invention, the temptation would be greater. Secondly, the knowledge we gain, the kind of theories we develop about the world, affect our wishes as well as the way we feel about the world, and therefore impinge on our mythical imagination. It is perfectly natural that the acceptance of new physical theories would erode the pleasure we take in telling certain stories, if those newly acquired physical beliefs alter our wishes and attitude to the world. But this does not prove, I think, that the stories were told as explanatory hypotheses, or that the people feel that the physical theories play the same roles as the stories they abandoned. And thirdly, myths may also grow around the biased selection of historical facts or beliefs, which happen to be true. And for this, I will give an example related to the country which I was called Damir. When the Japanese literary scholar Morinaga in the 18th century attempted to build in his country a self-conscious sense of its literary and cultural identity, the features be contrasted with that of China, its powerful neighbor, and for most of the populace, the only foreign country which impinged on their consciousness. He sorted in the features of the Japanese literary work that he cherished most. It happened to be The Tales of Genji, the psychological novel written in the beginning of the 11th century by a lady of the court. Norinaga thought that its virtues lay in its responsiveness to nature and perceptiveness to human emotions, which for him were feminine traits exemplified in the novel so well because the author was a perceptive woman. Now, from this, interesting to observe that the Levi-Straussian contrast of putting female and nature on one side, and culture and male on the other, has never been a part of the popular myth in Japan, probably because culture, even the most artificial works of art and literature, this was believed to be very natural. And also because the central literary life in cultural times was the empress's court rather than the male world. From this historical fact, Norinaga probably went on to state the norm, which expressed what was to be most cherished in Japanese heritage. But he laid also the groundwork of the myth that this responsiveness was the essence of the Japanese mind, in contrast to what he called the Chinese mind, Karagako. Under the latter, he sought in the mind of those Japanese contemporaries of his who were most influenced by Chinese civilization. Now, as the greatest Cyrohouse of his time happened to be the Neo-Confucian scholars in Japan, the features of the so-called Chinese mentality which he chose were equally selective, equally biased as the features he selected out of the Japanese. Namely, the propensity to make judgments about the good and bad, or right and wrong about everything, and to seek to define the nature of all things. He thought, as a matter of fact, the Japanese are more literary and the Chinese more philosophical. He did not, strangely enough, include the mental features of those two Chinese poets whose works have been cherished in Japan for at least 700 years, nor of those Taoist ink painters who are much admired in Japan in his own time. It wasn't as if he didn't even know them. He was quite a dilettante who liked art, and yet he just were very selective in order to make these myths. What is interesting about this myth is that not only did it become very powerful and was to influence those nationalists who brought about the Restoration and the opening up of the nation in 1868, but that it has survived today, even after nationalism as ideology has been abandoned, or hopefully abandoned, after the Second World War. The only change is in the identity of those to whom the Japanese contrast themselves. In the popular myth, it is the Westerner who is thought to be judgmental, craving for clear-cut answers and consistency. The Japanese have preserved their myth of being responsive to nature, sensitive, and illogical. Now, the numerous exposures made by themselves, as well as by others, of what they did to prisoners of war or to lands they occupied, makes them aware, perfectly aware at a certain level, that they can be equal to any in their insensitivity. Their considerable acquaintance with Western works of art or literature, sensual as well as discursive, lyrical as well as mystical, makes them also know that in some sense, that there is a great diversity of sensibility in the West. Yet all this has strangely not destroyed their myth. The following, for example, is from a work of a well-known elderly Japanese philologist, much admired philologist, published in 1978. I quote, "In Japan, the seasons were mild and people could live comfortably as long as they worked. They did not therefore nurture a rigorous religious belief, which can be arrived at only after being tested by hardship, nor did they nurture the attitude of pursuing logical consistency, which can be achieved only by physical struggle. People found their happiness in responding to nature and living emotively, rather than in pursuing logical consistency or in contemplating eternity." It is rather bizarre belief that physical struggle is the only way you can maintain logical consistency. Comes from a rather influential Japanese historian who wrote in 1935, after his stay in Iowa, a book called Climate Anthropological Investigation, anthropological in the sense of Pascal, not in the sense of anthropologist, a scientist. And he thought that the basic types of mentality monsoon. And I won't go into detail, but that is all a part of this myth. In the same year, a book with the title Japanese Brain, written by a Japanese neurophysiologist specializing in ear, was published, which attempted to show that the sensitivity of the speakers of Japanese to sounds in nature, like the chirping of crickets, was reflected in the difference of what happened in the dominant hemisphere of the brain of the Japanese from that of the non-Japanese. The book became a bestseller. Now, both authors, it's true to say, have received criticism in Japan. But the fact that there were books published by respectable publishers and had big sales, as well as books that received favorable reviews too, indicate something about the Japanese national myth. Now, other countries and races have done the same, choosing features which people they admire within their own group and then exemplify, then take it as a norm of what they would like to be, and then coming at last to believe that they are all endowed with the features in question. It seems that most components American beliefs in his or her individualism, just as an earnest English woman believes in her sense of humor, or the confused Frenchman in his artistic clarity of mind. I've taken the Japanese example at some length only because I'm most familiar with it, and I can understand the temptation from within too, and because it is very closely linked with the belief in the opposition of sensibility and reason, which was the topic of this paper. Now then, to just briefly conclude, what I wanted to say was that myths contain many component sentences that can be adopted by purported empirical theories. But what makes a myth is not so much the peculiarity of the sentences, whether it's more open or more ambiguous or less ambiguous, that make up or the texts that make up the story. It is the attitude it creates in a public who partake in them. It has to be told and retold, and cherishes a story that illustrates an aspect of reality about which people express their wishes or feelings, whilst at the same time believed by the people to be fiction. A myth always carries within it the possibility or danger, therefore, that any part of it can be taken as a literal description of reality. And that is where the excitement of recounting a myth lies for many people. When Weidenberg asserted that women have no souls, it was in one sense a trite illustration of his cliché prejudices about people's abilities, say women's abilities and character. But because it carried the possibility of being taken literally by some people, and it conveyed with it its shocking and provocative flavor. Wittgenstein's claim that a whole mythology is deposited in our language has to therefore be taken with caution. It is not the case that myths, like theories, become part of the semantics of the words we use. Water may mean, amongst other things, that it is H2O, but the soul does not mean that which is divided into two, 1, 2, 3, whatever. It is not part of the meaning of the word sensibility that it is embodied by women or by Bushmen or whoever. Yet these myths can, as Wittgenstein suggests, be deposited. That is, it can be left and laid on the language we use. We talk of the head controlling the heart, so we know very well that both brain and heart are necessary for motive responses as well as mechanical thinking.